in order to begin my presentation, from what you have seen and from what you have heard on the program, I am here to talk about therapeutic applications in humanitarian contexts, in the context of hope, which is the central theme of our conference today, yesterday and today. My concern is that if we are not clear about what we do and how we clearly conceptualize what we are thinking and what we're doing, this hope can be for the wrong thing, as they say. So I'm starting with Aristotle, who reminds us that hope is not just an abstraction, but genuine hope happens when one actually experiences real fear of a negative outcome. Then you hope. Otherwise, it's just idle thinking. And only when, genuine hope is only when it has the courage to act in pursuit of the hoped for positive outcome, despite the real fear and dangers. If that is not, if these two conditions are not there, according to Aristotle, hope is abstract, youthful fantasies. So the other thing that I want to use as a starting point for me are the thoughts of T.S. Eliot, who got the Nobel Prize for Literature many years ago, who says, "I said to my soul, be still and wait without hope, for hope would be for the wrong thing." So he reminds us that stillness is quite important, what we would call therapeutic reflection, and not rush to do something because there is a need, but to reflect, to be still, to understand clearly what is happening and then act, because hope could be for the wrong thing. And I want us to be reminded of what our sister discipline, psychology, I don't know whether it's sister or stepsister or whatever, you decide what kind of relationship we have with psychology as psychotherapists. And I'm reminded of George Miller's presidential address in 1969, when he introduced his famous dictum, giving psychology away. That was a vision. That was a hope for psychology then. When he could imagine nothing that would be more relevant to human welfare and nothing that could pose a greater challenge to the next generation of psychologists than to discover how to best give psychology away. In other words, make it more popular, give it to the people. And for him, this would create a new and different public conception of what is humanly possible and humanly desirable. But, of course, he reminded himself and all of us that he was keenly aware that giving psychology away will not be a simple task. And this is what we need to, against this background, think about psychotherapy. Have we also given psychotherapy away? And should we, or could we, or and what is the hope connected with that? And in order to think about that, we need to be reminded that the psychotherapy has changed radically over the last 50 years due to the interaction between the internal theoretical developments in psychotherapy itself and the organizational necessities, as well as external realities in the world around us. And this is what I'm going to be focusing today, the external realities in the world around us. And this is what we're all experiencing right now. And the announcement just before that reminds us, before we started, reminds us of these complexities. So psychotherapy as a profession, as theory, as practice, and as position in society has changed radically. And even earlier, of course, before the 50 years, psychotherapy moved away from its initial roots, which, and let's not forget, were the medical roots, focusing on pathology, but also philosophical traditions, as well as spiritual practices. Before we go further, let us delineate at least 3 forms of understanding therapeutic practices. The first and the easiest one that used to be the traditional one was in terms of schools, approaches, ideologies. And of course, we know that we have, I don't know, the psychodynamic, the behavioral, the humanistic, then the systemic. All of these were also called modalities. These have reasonably coherent theoretical systems and frameworks, and they have corresponding trainings, and they have corresponding institutions, etc. Nevertheless, we should not forget that within the last 50 years, much less than that, what we have seen is the wide proliferation of actual, what I would call freestanding techniques. These are specific sets of applied procedures, toolkits, they're called so many different things, like Tree of Life, narrative exposure therapy, EMDR, etc., etc. These do not necessarily, or at least when they start, do not necessarily have the coherent theoretical frameworks and the trainings and the institutions. Some of these started, I remember, you must remember, that, you go for a 1 weekend training and you would pick up one of these techniques. But in addition, let's not forget that we have these frameworks. We have frameworks. And this is what I will try to present to you, and that Nevena hinted at, the framework that I developed over the years, working in over, nearly actually 40 countries for many years in different contexts. And these are sets of basic principles that are applied to each specific context, developing appropriate epistemological perspectives for each situation. So it's a question of how we conceptualize things and how we fit them together in order to show us what we can actually do. That's what I'm talking by a framework. And this is what I'm going to present to you today. And these are the realities that psychotherapy needed to adapt itself from the tsunamis to the pandemics, to the wars now, with the war now that we have in Ukraine. Humanitarian emergencies present us with severe forms of adversity at a collective level. Let us face it clearly. Existing schools of psychotherapy have proven to be unable to adequately respond in terms of their theory, practice, and organization. You cannot take a clear psychodynamic theory and put it here, or even behavioral, etc. All of them needed to be adapted. And also there is a need for new forms of psychological help and psychotherapeutic practices. And that's how what we would call today the psychosocial and trauma industry has emerged. And I do call it industry because it's one of the biggest existing industries in the world today. Let's not forget that side. The term psychosocial interventions has emerged mainly from the Armenian earthquake in 1988. It took a lot of impetus with Palestinian uprisings. A great impetus, unfortunately, from the breakup wars in Yugoslavia. And the attempt has been to address not only material, but also psychological and social aspects of a human being, in short, to grasp the totality of the human being. Let's be clear, these are not unified and clear schools or techniques, and they have different emphasis. What is referred to as psychosocial can be with a medical emphasis or a human rights emphasis or psychology or social or arts or community or whatever. So the question is that we need to ask, has psychotherapy been snatched away from us, or leaked away. Psychosocial interventions are a hybrid and an unplanned enterprise. I'm not saying necessarily that that is bad. The question is, can we, this is a fact, this is a reality, in what way can we collaborate with them or try to make them best in the best possible way? George Miller was talking about the deprofessionalization of psychotherapy. It was a motto, it was a slogan. It was a war cry in psychology for many years. We need to deprofessionalize. We need to go out and teach other disciplines the basic principles of psychology. What we have seen is actually, de facto, we have experienced a deprofessionalization of psychotherapy in terms of its theory, training, and organizations. I pick up something from an influencer garbage. It's on the media. The elite language of therapy used to be closely guarded as it began as a niche set of terms and definitions in academic circles. However, in recent years, therapy speak has bled out into the mainstream discourse. So these people are saying it hasn't been snatched or leaked out, but it has bled out. Is that good or a bad thing? Is there a hope in that or not? Or are these questions the appropriate ones? Well, let's first of all go and see what is the landscape, what is the situation that we are dealing with. When we're talking about these humanitarian emergencies, this humanitarian context, we're talking about a unique event that, in effect, the best word for me to describe it is having an overwhelming impact. And the nature of the events and their impact affect everybody. It's not only the people we try to help, but us, our theories, society, the way we conceptualize things, the way we even think of what facts are and not facts. There is an enormity of suffering, losses, destructiveness. There is disorientation, it's unfamiliarity, it's complexity. Emmy described that quite clearly also in her presentation yesterday. And when we are overwhelmed by this like dark cloud descending on us, I like these images, from the emotionally charged experiences plus the pressing needs, as human beings, we have an unrelenting need to understand. And inevitably, what we understand, the formulations of understanding we have, tend to be oversimplified and polarized, which means they lack complexity. And this is a very serious problem for me and for all of us. And when we have this polarization, think of the discourse in these situations. Slogans, refugees welcome, refugees out. I'm using just one, the refugee discourse. Bad refugees, good migrants. Resilient refugees, traumatized refugees. Vulnerable refugees, dangerous refugees. Refugees are as survivors or refugees are victims. And ultimately it comes to us, either we're omnipotent and we can do everything, or we're totally impotent and we can do nothing. Sharply polarized situation. Whenever we're overwhelmed, the natural effect is that our processing function is hindered. Our processing function is hindered. Regardless of our attachments, regardless of our styles, regardless of anything, every human being's processing function is likely to be hindered as a result of being exposed to these overwhelming situations and experiences. And when I'm talking about processing, I'm not talking only about cognitive or emotional processing, but also existential processing. In other words, it affects our very identity, our values, our beliefs, our epistemological clarity and position. Epistemology is not just simply cognition, it's the way we locate ourselves as human beings in relation to the events and experiences in front of us. So when we are exposed to these sort of situations and being overwhelmed, we need to remember that whereas ordinarily we consider and process consciously and non-consciously all aspects and shades, positive and negative, when we're overwhelmed, our processing, I keep repeating this, is diminished. We oversimplify, polarize. We don't have complexity. We have no space to think, as we say in psychotherapy. That's a very important concept, that we have no space to think. And therefore, we develop what I call impulsive conceptualization. Impulsively, we try to think of something. And ultimately, often we fall into what I call epistemological acting out. In other words, formulating some positions that are impulsive. And other consequences are partial understanding, pars pro toto, which in Latin means the part for the whole. We take one part as if it represents the whole. Also, we have misassociations. I like to call these misassociations. Conspiracy theories are based on misassociations. You take a little bit of half-truth there, a little bit of half-truth there, you put them together and the whole concoction is wrong. But it gives you some kind of confidence that at least you understand something and you grasp something when these things are too overwhelming. In effect, we distort reality, and when we distort reality, it's impossible to plan effectively and act effectively. Let me give you two examples, very clear examples. When we're talking about PTSD, we all know, we should know, the criteria of PTSD, very clear criteria. Yet what we see, we take pars pro toto, one part for the whole. If somebody suffers from flashbacks and lack of concentration or something else, they suffer from PTSD quickly. We take one part and we take the whole. And we do that, all of us tend to do that. All of us tend to do that. Another hazard of this inappropriate processing is time. And again, I go back to the PTSD because very clearly it reminds us that we cannot talk about PTSD until we see that these symptoms persist for over a month. And even in terms of the delayed expression, until 6 months, which means strictly speaking, you cannot diagnose PTSD before 6 months. And what do we do? All of us, even professionals, we see the situation in Ukraine. They suffer from PTSD. Wait a minute, they suffer, period. Yes. They suffer distress. Yes. Do we need to call it PTSD in order to give validity to their suffering? Think about that. Is that appropriate use of psychology and psychotherapy, or is that inappropriate? Let's not be deceived by this kind of cause and effect, this what I call atemporal causality. Adversity creates trauma. Wait a minute. We're human beings. There are the meaning attribution processes. We make meaning of these situations. And also there is time. There is more complexity there. This is what I'm talking about. Impulsive conceptualization and epistemological acting out. When we are making too quick connections between cause and effect. So let me remind you what these meaning attribution processes are. We all know them. There are all of these factors that affect the way we experience events. Starting from personal to relational, supporting systems, gender, age. There are so many studies of how our experiences of events is mediated by all of these factors. Yet immediately we say, because a person is exposed to some adversity, immediately that person will be traumatized. This is so That's impulsive conceptualization. That is epistemological acting out. The power positions, there's so much research on that. Circumstances of actual devastating events. Set meaning systems used to account for the events and for the experiences of the events. That matters. A lot of people that I work in different parts of the world, they say to me, it was Allah's will that this happened. They have a set meaning that they interpret their experience, and that happens automatically. They don't sit and they say, oh, how am I going to interpret it? That's the way they perceive it from the beginning, as Allah's will, or Allah is punishing them, or Allah is showing them the way. How do we position ourselves as psychotherapists there, respecting them and yet trying to understand and connect with them when they have their own set meaning systems? Hope and lack of hope matters, not only the past, but also the present and the future, current conditions, circumstances, plus a host of sociopolitical, cultural, economic, legal factors. All of these things matter. All of these things matter. And yet we oversimplify everything. We polarize everything and we say, oh, you have been exposed to this situation, therefore you're traumatized. That's why the adversity grid emerged. I developed this over the years and is used widely in the United Nations. I've written manuals for that, for the IOM, International Organization for Migration, and for many places, in order to remind us that yes, there are negative consequences of being exposed to adversity, but also all human beings and all individuals, families, workplace organizations, communities retain certain strengths. And also they gain something from this exposure to adversity. Let us go slowly. It's important even in order to increase the level of complexity. In these sort of situations, we shy away from complexity and we run away from complexity, but then we oversimplify and polarize. So even with the negative ones, to distinguish between the most severe to the least severe, because not everything is negative in the same way. For example, a psychiatric disorder is not the same as, here is a psychiatric disorder is a serious dysfunctionality, rather than, a person may just feel distress and feel suffering. Yes, but that's not a psychiatric disorder. We need to make distinctions of the severity of these negative effects. So I'm going back to reminding ourselves that there are a lot of unchanged parts in each individual, in each person, that especially positive unchanged. There are negative unchanged, but also positive unchanged. And this is what I call resilience. This is what I call resilience. I know resilient is a term that is used widely everywhere, but I have a very clear operational definition of resilience. Those positive strengths that existed before, and they have been retained despite the exposure to adversity. And these are unchanged parts. So when we go there and we think of a person, we're treating them only about their trauma. We forget that actually that person has some strengths. And my argument is that everybody does have some strengths. The question is which ones, and are they aware, and are we aware? And moreover, what we should not forget is what I call adversity activated development, which are the positive effects of being exposed to adversity. And these also exist. These also exist. So here is to be reminded that by resilience, I refer to the existing positive qualities, characteristics, behaviors, functioning relationships that were retained from before the adversity. That is, they survived the exposure to adversity. Whereas the adversity activated development refers to the new positive qualities, characteristics, behaviors, functioning relationships that did not exist before the exposure of adversity, but were acquired, activated specifically by the adversity. There are so many examples. I can give you endless examples, not only of my experience, clinical work, because as Nevena said, I work from the university, I work as a psychotherapist in ordinary institutions, as well as in refugee camps and in so many other contexts. Here, I am reminded of Martine Wright, an English woman who was injured during a terrorist attack in London, in the London Underground in 2005. And she wrote this book, Unbroken, quite interestingly. I mean, look at her body is very broken. Definitely, she has 2 legs amputated. I want to read this to you. She says, in some ways, it was the best thing that ever happened to me. The best thing that happened to her. The best thing that happened to her was that she was in that train when the terrorist bomb exploded, and she was nearly kicked and she lost her legs. What does she mean? No, I can't say the best thing. That's not quite right. It was the most life-changing thing. She's struggling because she feels something positive. She doesn't know how to express it. But she calls it life-changing thing that has had such profound and positive effects on it. It may sound absolutely mad to say that, but look at this house. Oscar, my son, Nick, my husband, my whole family, being able to stand in the sun, listening to the birds. She's talking about new capacities to appreciate life. I truly, truly believe that good can come out of the bad. People ask me if I would turn the clock back. Well, part of me says, yeah, it would be nice to have my legs, but my life now is so amazing. I've had the opportunity to do so much, meet so many people. I don't think I would turn that clock back if I had the chance. Now, this is not a unique human being. My argument is that we need to think about all of the people that are working with and realize in what way they have adversity activated development, and we're not focusing on that. Yes, Martine was definitely a victim of the adversity. There's no question about that. There are victims of wars, there are victims of adversities, there are victims of earthquakes, of pandemics, etc., etc. That's the inevitable outcome of being exposed to adversity, to actual devastating events and circumstances. But we need to make a distinction between that and people developing a victim identity. And that is the danger, because often, without noticing in the way we interact with people inadvertently, we install in them a victim identity, which, as you know, it's a dreadful and very most debilitating situation, because it drains responsibility from people, encourages passivity, inappropriate dependence and entitlement. It disempowers. In short, it teaches them helplessness. Also, we need to make distinction between distress and disorder, as I said earlier. Yes, people are in great distress, and we need to, that should be for us sufficient. We don't need to validate their distress by calling it disorder and pathologizing it further. Distress is normal response to abnormal circumstances, where disorder is not. And here are a lot of dilemmas in our therapeutic care. How not to pathologize and victimize the survivors. And we need to be very careful about that, because unfortunately, vulnerability is rewarded. And all our organizational structures of care and help is based on helping the people who are vulnerable. Yes, they are vulnerable, but in what sense? And can we also see their complexity and their totality, and not to see them only as vulnerable? Remember, pars pro toto, not to take their vulnerability as the totality of them. Because then we fall into situations that in the literature, and I urge you to look at this literature, we refer to as politics of pity, spectatorship of suffering, distant suffering. We need to become familiar with that. We need to avoid what I call positive dehumanization. Yes, the bad is dehumanized, with their wars, with their torture, with all sorts of, with their abuse. But I'm afraid we also dehumanize if we look at these human beings, the totality and the greatness of human beings and dignity of human beings, and we see them only as victims, only as trauma sufferers, only in terms of vulnerable people, then actually we are dehumanizing them. And that's a very serious warning for us. No hope for that. We're thinking of serious hope. So we need to avoid positive dehumanization. A very, very, very difficult next point, how not to demonize the perpetrators whilst holding them accountable for what they, for the abuse that they have inflicted. We need to remember the dangers of the victim triangle. You fix people in that sort of situation, everybody loses. Everybody loses. I happen to work also. I'm a trustee in a charity that works with prisoners. Yes, they are bad people. They are human beings, but they have done bad things. They are not bad people. They are not bad people. They are human beings that they have done bad things. If we're not there to help them, we take it for granted that they are bad people, and then we do to them what they did to their abuser, the people that they abused. We need to be very careful about that. No simple recipes. Adversity survivors, I often say, are like philosophers because they ask, if they have the space, and we don't force them to talk only about their trauma, but they talk about their whole experience. They ask questions like, why me? Why did it happen to me? I mean, we're sitting here in our homes, and people are suffering for war, as we have all been experiencing and hearing every day. And we ask, why me? What is the nature of good and evil? How come that human beings can be so cruel? What are the human values? And under these severe forms of adversity, as we say, according to the cliche, people either find God or lose God. In other words, their whole system of meaning is up for grabs. It's just reshuffled. It's reset, to use a catchy term today, that is used a lot today. So I want us to be reminded that yes, as psychotherapists, we need to have at least two languages. The languages of damage and repair, yes, we're there for that. That is very clearly comprehensible. It follows the kind of the medical discourse. It fits in with the organizational care systems. But the outcome, it's fairly static. You fix an organism and you just leave them where they are. But if we give credence and dignity to these situations where people ask unanswerable questions, what I call language of poetic or painful incomprehensibility, we need to find ways to also validate that. Because this seeming incomprehensibility has the possibility for creative and transformational potentialities. And we need to remember Martine. So we go back to what psychology tried to do by giving things away. What he was hoping, George Miller, was that he would give society the tools that psychology developed, which was prediction and not control of behavior. Have they succeeded that? High hopes, empty hopes. Well, instead, there is some degree of useful applications from psychology, but mainly what we have is a proliferation of what I call psychologies, which is the language of psychological jargon. Therapy speak, psychot speak, pop psychology. Is that a hope? I remember again what Aristotle said, and I think hope should be if we actually strive, but with humility, and become aware of our own limitations. of the enormity of the task, of the destructive realities, not only around us, but also inside us and between us. And when we have the courage to grapple with complexity, avoid oversimplification and polarization, avoid victimization of sufferers and demonization of perpetrators. We need to humanize both. I remember I lived in South Africa and worked in South Africa for many years. A poet, a black poet said, wrote a poem about the white oppressors and said, you can do whatever you like. You can prevent me from sitting on a bench with you. Well, you can prevent me to go to the same hospital with you when it was forced segregation, but you cannot prevent me from loving you. That's very profound. So avoid the comfort of the consensus thinking, dominant discourses, trauma discourse, trauma. Yes, we should not ignore trauma, but we should look at human beings in their totality, in their dignity, also with their existing strengths and their newly acquired strengths, and dare to discern complexity. Ability to listen more and preach less, and reconnect now with medical and pathological context of our past, but also philosophical traditions and spiritual practices. And develop more coherent and collaborative ventures. That's why I call this framework a synergic framework of synergic therapeutic complexity. Synergy between our strengths, our individual and group efforts, and our organizational resources with the people that we help, the strengths and the strengths of the enormity of the task, their retained strengths, their resilient characteristics, and their new strengths, with the wider supporting networks, ethnic community, etc. And here is really quite important. Let me give you a quick example. I know we don't have time, but I go to a refugee camp. You can go there with your tool of kids, with a toolkit to sort of, as a psychotherapist, to tell them how to do things and all of that. But also there's another way. Go there and look at the local imam and sit down and speak with them. What has he been doing? What has he been successful with? What difficulties does he have? Can we collaborate with him? Can we have the humility to go and see that there are other forms of help, that we need to find ways to collaborate synergically, put our synergies together, rather than we go there and teach them. The Gestalt people go there to teach their Gestalt. The TA go to teach their TA, etc. You know, we're colonizers. I'm not saying we should abandon your beliefs and your systems and your allegiances and your flags, but can we also open up and try to learn from other people what they do that is helpful and therapeutic, and try to collaborate synergically with them? Therapeutic is therefore being therapeutic, not necessarily offering psychotherapeutic techniques, and not to succumb to the oversimplified formulae and slogans, but develop a epistemological astuteness and agility. I always try to finish with this image. Here, I took a photograph of this that was on the island of Chios in Greece during the refugee crisis, when refugees were coming from across Turkey. So here is Turkey. You can actually see Turkey. They arrive here, they are wet. The Red Cross gives them new clothes. They throw it away. They get into a bus and they go. And then I just noticed this thing here. What is this thing here? This is a makeup brush. Never mind my hope. Do I recognize that these people have hope? And what form of hope do they have? And do I create space for me to see that in the first place? Because their hope is expressed in so many different ways. This is what I wanted to tell you and remind you, yes, that these are two relevant books that I have that you can consider if you want, and a lot of these issues that I'm talking about at this framework we are teaching at the University of Essex in our refugee care programs. Thank you very much, and I look very much forward to speaking with you and interacting with you, because it's so important to put things in some context when we interact with each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Renos. I have been looking into the chat. I don't know whether you probably haven't looked at it, although I know that you are doing many things at once, always. And you are having very many thank yous and saying that these are true and profound ideas. And thank you for reminding us about remaining humble, no matter how much we think that we know. And also that we should be aware of universal fragile human condition. And actually that it is very important to share our distresses and find adaptive responses to our needs, and not to colonize psychological insights as absolute truths. And thank you for presentation and reminding us how to deal with complex trauma. And also thank you for reflecting. And so, repeatedly people are asking to be able to see the presentation, to share it. And
any specific questions?
No, there is one. It says that this is pure logotherapy. I don't see any. Can we see this on YouTube? Yes. And should we demonize Putin? Should we not demonize or demonize Putin? This is one comment. And I don't see any questions, but perhaps people in the room would have a question or a comment. Our colleagues who are here. Sorry. Sorry, Elfriede, I didn't hear it. Okay, so here people are nodding in silence and supporting your thoughts.
Yes. I suppose I'll take that question about whether we should demonize Putin or not, although I don't like to talk about these specific issues in this kind of raw context. I'm asking for complexity, and I'm asking for hope to come from a point of stillness. And Putin is a human being. I mean, it's easy to demonize Putin. Demonize Putin easily, very easily. We demonized Saddam Hussein. We demonized Milosevic. We demonized Gaddafi. What happened? What happened is we need to find ways to collaborate with human beings. Of course, you will tell me when they don't collaborate, what do we do? Well, we have a lot of examples. I mean, thinking, for example, of Viktor Frankl in concentration camps, they dehumanize you. If you also want to dehumanize them, then you become the same as them. Do you want to do that? Adam Small is saying that. At least you cannot deprive me of the love that I have for you, because I see you as a human being struggling and getting things wrong. What do we do in family therapy when we have an abusing father? Yes, we protect the victim and we help the perpetrator to face the consequences of their actions, but also we don't dehumanize them. We should not, we should make a big distinction between the two. The moment we dehumanize anybody, we are in the same position as the other person, as the dehumanizer. Even if somebody is dehumanizing, if we do the same, who won? He won. He won because he got us on his side to become also another dehumanizing machine, thoughtlessly. This is the therapeutic space that we should have. This is what T.S. Eliot is talking about. That kind of heart be still. Because hope may be for the wrong thing. Don't rush. This is the epistemological traps. We need to be very careful. And this is what we're talking about, complexity, discerning very subtle things. Yes, of course, we condemn aggression and war and atrocities. But we hope that human beings are human beings and we're going to be there to help them. In most conflicts that I have worked, I try to work on both sides. And it is therapeutic for them to know that I work on both sides. Because I'm working with their human suffering and not with their political views. It's easy. The slogans are easier, flying around. These slogans or that slogans.
There is one question about, could you tell us more about the two languages, the language of damage and the language of repair?
Yeah, well, the language of damage and repair is one. In other words, you see somebody who is damaged and you try to repair them. That's one part of our psychotherapy. Another part of our psychotherapy is to allow them to enter into this incomprehensibility of these questions of why me, what is the nature of good and evil, or things like that. We're not there as, I know that some of you would like to be gurus and tell people what is good and bad. We need to respect human beings. But we are here to validate their questioning and the courage they have as human beings to pose unanswerable questions. And for us to create space to contain unanswerable questions. Because the moment they dare to pose unanswerable questions, they are connecting with their human dignity. And then they avoided the dehumanization that the others are trying to impose on them.
Okay. Thank you. I cannot find any questions anymore, only comments that are actually expanding your ideas and also reminding us that as human beings and as therapists, we cannot ignore, but we can try to our politicians, decision makers, and also being aware how difficult it is to connect with them.
Right. Well, I want to say something about that, and I think I don't want to sort of go into great details, but if you do certain work and people call you, I've been called by many governments, and in a modest way, I have been responsible for changing policies with reference to refugees. I don't want to mention the governments, but it is important for us to think about income. Do we achieve that with our slogans standing in the streets? Yes, there is value for that in terms of public protest, but in terms of quality of our work, develop appropriate work, and people will identify you and they will ask you. And I'm asked constantly all the time by many governments and organizations, and it is, and for example, the framework that I'm talking about, has been adopted very, very widely. So we should not lose hope, but we need to, going back to Aristotle, find ways of how to make that hope real and not just be adolescent fantasy, that because we believe in some things, everybody else will believe in some.
Okay, so how to retain sense and practice sensitively, yes? To have both sense and sensibility.
Yeah.
Okay.